What basically we're doing here is, in my opinion, the Democrats are asking Attorney General Barr to violate the law. It's not only against the law, but it would even be criminal to disclose grand jury material without a court order. It's obvious to me that this is just a continuation of an attempt to undermine the President of the United States. For the last 2 years, members on this committee have said that there has been collusion with the Trump administration and President Trump with Russia to undermine the 2016 election, and as revealed in the summary, this is absolutely not true. So I really wish that we could work on big issues instead of continuing this circus on undermining the President of the United States. I serve on 3 committees, and in every single committee, it is obvious from the very first organizational meeting that there is a coordinated attempt by the Democrats to undermine the President of the United States, and this is all about the 2020 presidential election. The public really wants us to work on big issues together, and I ask my Democratic colleagues to do that and quit this circus. I will yield time to the gentleman, Mr. Jordan from Ohio.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding, and I too wish to support the Buck Amendment. I would just ask the fundamental question: why are we here? Seems to me we're here because the Mueller report wasn't what the Democrats thought it was going to be. In fact, it was just the opposite. What did the Attorney General tell us that the principal finding of Mr. Mueller's report were? No new indictments, no sealed indictments, no collusion, no obstruction. On the question,
Jordan, will the gentleman yield?
I only got a little bit of time because
I only have a short question. You made reference to the Mueller report. Have you seen it? Because we haven't.
No, I've seen the principal findings from the Attorney General.
Well, would the gentleman yield for a quick question? I promise it's short. Mr. Jordan? You reported that the report states that there's no obstruction. What's your basis for saying that?
Did the sentence where he said they did not find obstruction? I understand the sentence you're referring to where he talks about no exoneration either, but then there are 3 paragraphs after where he points out that there was not the elements of obstruction. In fact, the letter from the Attorney General referencing the special counsel report said no new indictments, no sealed indictments, no collusion, and as I just pointed out, did not find obstruction. On the question of collusion, was very clear. He said there were multiple opportunities for people associated with the Trump campaign to collude, and they didn't. So multiple times where the forbidden fruit was placed in front of them and they didn't bite. But all that does, I would also point out this. There's been reference from the Democrats relative to Watergate and the Clinton special counsel. Watergate, there was a break-in. With Clinton, there was perjury. With the chief charge of this special counsel's investigation, there was no collusion. But here we are today. Well, actually 3 weeks ago, the chairman of the committee launched 81 letters to 60-some different individuals. And now today we're going to subpoena documents that the AG said he will give us in a matter of days. But maybe the most important point, I think, is the one that my colleague from Texas made, Mr. Ratcliffe. The idea that the chairman of the Intelligence Committee said he wants everything made public, including classified information, and the idea that the chair of the Judiciary Committee, the House Judiciary Committee, said this week that he wants everything made public, including grand jury material, that's maybe the scariest thing of all. So the Attorney General has said he's going to turn this over in a matter of days. Let's wait. Let's get the information, and then let's look at it then.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As far as the substitute, that's fine. But I'm glad we're using props today, because this is what's happening here. The chairman wants you to look at one thing when the reality is another thing. He's wanting you to look at this bottle of water and say, this is full, and then he's wanting you to look at this bottle of water and say, it's full too. It doesn't work. You can't say the Starr report, or even going back to impeachment, which we'll get to in a minute, and then come along and say Mueller is full too. It's the same. They're not the same. And as long as we perpetrate this fraud of saying that they're the same, then we're going to continue down this process of saying that we've got a problem here. Because the Starr report, which actually came out, let's actually go to what it said. The Starr had a requirement under the Independent Counsel Act, 28 U.S.C. 595, to advise the House of Representatives of any substantial credible information which may constitute grounds for an impeachment. Remember, it was the Janet Reno Justice Department, after the Starr report was written, that rewrote the regulations that we're under today. Starr, Mueller, two different things. And if we understand this, then we can understand the problem we have here. I feel for the chairman. He's trying to make an analogy that just won't work. He's doing as good a job as he possibly can. It just doesn't work. The other interesting issue in here is he's used two precedents for getting this information, both of which are impeachment. If the chairman truly wanted to get at this information, then he can go to what I believe many in their heart desire is open the impeachment inquiry. Maybe that's what we're going to get to today. But if you use the precedent of impeachment, not the precedent of subpoenas, then there's a problem. And we've got to understand this is nothing. If this was simply about the Mueller report today, and we had waited till after we got the Mueller report and we said there's still stuff we don't like, then I could see this happening. I could see why we'd come together and ask for subpoenas. Any attorney on this, that's what you do. When you don't get what you want, you ask for the subpoenas, not beforehand. When the Attorney General has already said, I'm going to do this. So the problem is, look, it's a tough problem. I feel for him. But as long as you're trying to compare the full and the empty and say they're both full, that's going to be a problem. The problem also I have with this is it just not about the Attorney General and the Mueller report? Is he went ahead and added 5 other individuals. Why were those 5 other individuals? Let's take a look at the names. The 5 other individuals: Don McGahn, Steve Bannon, Hope Hicks, Rance Priebus, and Ann Donaldson. All of which have either gave information or answered and responded to their initial letters. Why are these 5? They're close to the president. The closer you get to the president, the press writes about it. The press writes about associates of the president get a subpoena. Let's take this for what it is. We don't have our popcorn machine yet. We're getting it for our side because this is great political theater. But as long as they're trying to convince you that this one and this one are the same, then we're going to go down the same sad road. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I just want to comment on one thing. The argument is made that the prior history is irrelevant because Mr. Jaworski and Mr. Starr operated under a different law than Mr. Mueller is operating. That fact is true. However, we have the same constitutional rights as the committee did in those days, and we have the same constitutional duty as the committee did in those days. And we have the right and the necessity to get all the information to fulfill our constitutional duty. In late 1973, the Nixon administration had an idea. When Special Counsel Archibald Cox asked the White House to turn over recordings of conversations held in the Oval Office, President Nixon offered instead to provide the tapes to Senator John Stennis of Mississippi. Nixon proposed that Stennis, who was famously hard of hearing, would listen to the recordings himself, then provide summaries of the tapes to the special prosecutor. The Nixon administration justified the proposal as a means to protect sensitive information that would not ordinarily be made part of the record. In hindsight, of course, we know that President Nixon had ulterior motives. In any event, Cox had a job to do. That job required him to evaluate the full record for himself, and he refused the president's offer. President Nixon ordered him fired the next day. The dynamics of the Stennis Compromise, as it became known, should sound familiar to us. The Trump administration has an idea. They want to redact the Mueller report before they provide it to Congress. The Department of Justice says the proposal is a means to protect sensitive information that would not ordinarily be made part of the record. But we have reason to suspect this administration's motives. The Mueller report probably isn't the, quote, total exoneration, unquote, the president claims it to be. And in any event, the committee has a job to do. The Constitution charges Congress with holding the president accountable for alleged official misconduct. That job requires us to evaluate the evidence for ourselves, not the Attorney General's summary, not a substantially redacted synopsis, but the full report and the underlying evidence. The Attorney General proposes to redact 4 categories of information from the Mueller report: grand jury information, classified information, information related to ongoing prosecutions, and, quote, information that may unduly infringe on the personal privacy and reputational interests of peripheral third parties, close quote. The department is wrong to try to withhold that information from this committee. Congress is entitled to all of the evidence. This isn't just my opinion, it is also a matter of law. For precedent on 3 of the 4 categories, we need look no further than the summer of 2016, when, pursuant to congressional subpoena, the department and the FBI began to transfer more than 880,000 documents related to the Clinton investigation to the House of Representatives. That production included classified information, which we held in our secure facility and which we handle every day. It included information related to ongoing investigations, and it included information related to numerous third parties, many of whom this committee later interviewed as part of the Republican investigation into the investigation. The other category of information the Attorney General proposes to redact is grand jury information, normally protected under Rule 6E of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure. Many who seem eager to keep this information from Congress argue that the law does not allow grand jury information to be shared outside the Justice Department. That analysis is incomplete, if not outright incorrect. It is true that Rule 6E ordinarily prohibits the department from sharing grand jury information with the public. It is also true that, with proper authorization and under court order, the department must share grand jury information with this committee. That was the case in 1974, when Judge Sirica authorized the release of the Watergate Roadmap to this committee at the request of Special Counsel Leon Jaworski. It was the case in 1998, when a federal court permitted Ken Starr to release grand jury information, along with his report, to Congress. It was the case in 2008 and 2009, when this committee went directly to the grand jury twice to get information relevant to our investigation of Judge Thomas Porteous. On multiple occasions, I have asked Attorney General Barr to work with us to go to the court and obtain access to materials the department deems covered by Rule 6E. He has so far refused. I will give him time to change his mind, but if we cannot reach an accommodation, then we will have no choice but to issue subpoenas for these materials. And if the department still refuses, then it should be up to a judge, not the president and not his political appointee, to decide whether or not it is appropriate for the committee to review the complete record. The resolution before us today authorizes subpoenas for 2 categories of information. First, the resolution authorizes subpoenas for documents and testimony related to the full and unredacted report of Special Counsel Mueller. I believe the committee must have access to this information in order to perform its constitutionally mandated responsibility. The House of Representatives agreed with this proposition when last month it voted 420-0 in support of a resolution that demanded the release of the full report. Second, the resolution authorizes subpoenas for documents and testimony from certain former White House employees. Each of these individuals has had more than a month to produce documents to this committee voluntarily. We believe that these individuals may have received documents from the White House in preparation for their interviews with the special counsel. We also believe that these individuals may have turned this information over to their private attorneys. Under applicable federal law, President Trump waived his claims to executive privilege once this information was transmitted to outside counsel. Because we may have to go to court to obtain the complete text of the special counsel's report, and because the president may attempt to invoke executive privilege to withhold that evidence from us, it is imperative that the committee take possession of these documents and others without delay. Yesterday, the president presented me with the high honor of not 1, but 3 separate mentions on Twitter. He also talked about our relationship, which goes back several years, in a press conference yesterday afternoon. President Trump seems to think in 1998 I was opposed to public release of the Starr report, and that he has caught me changing my mind on the subject. let me set the record straight. In 1998, the debate was not about Congress receiving evidence. Congress had already received the full 445-page report and 17 boxes of additional documents, including grand jury material. We are owed that same opportunity today. In 1998, the central debate was about the public release of some of the materials accompanying the Starr report, materials that Congress already had and that described private sexual acts in lurid detail. Congress has no business broadcasting graphic accounts of the president's sex life. It was inappropriate in 1998. It would be inappropriate today. Our focus should be on the law. That is where our focus will remain so long as I am chairman. We are dealing now not with the president's private affairs, but with a sustained attack on the integrity of the republic by the president and his closest advisors. This committee requires the full report and the underlying materials because it is our job, not the Attorney General's, to determine whether or not President Trump has abused his office. And we require the report because one day, one way or another, the country will move on from President Trump. We must make it harder for future presidents to behave this way. We need a full accounting of the president's actions to do that work. Accordingly, I urge my colleagues to support the resolution. I will recognize myself to explain the amendment. This amendment makes only technical changes to the underlying resolution. I would like to use my time to elaborate on the point made in my opening statement, that there is ample precedent from other investigations involving allegations of wrongdoing by the president for the Judiciary Committee to receive not just the full report, but all of the underlying evidence, including grand jury material. In the investigation of Bill Clinton, the independent counsel Ken Starr produced to Congress a 445-page report, several thousand pages of appendices, and 17 boxes of underlying evidence and other materials. These boxes included all of the grand jury information protected by Rule 6E of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure. The Starr report and the underlying evidence and materials produced to this committee fill up volume after volume of the record in the Clinton impeachment proceedings. I am holding up only 2 of these many volumes that contain some of the evidence and materials underlying the Starr report that he produced to Congress. Here is volume 4, part 2 and part 3 that contain supplemental materials from the Starr report. All of these materials were delivered to the House immediately after Ken Starr completed the report. Looking at volume 4, part 3, it is filled with the grand jury testimony and other evidence from the Starr investigation that was produced to the House Judiciary Committee. For example, on page 3341, there is grand jury testimony of Stacey Desmond Porter. Here is a copy of it. There were boxes and boxes of such information produced by Ken Starr. Starr sought and obtained authorization from the court overseeing the grand jury to share the grand jury materials with Congress. A similar order permitting Congress to receive the grand jury materials in the Mueller investigation can and should be obtained here. The materials produced to Congress by Starr also included the interview memoranda of the witnesses who agreed to be voluntarily interviewed by Starr's office during his investigation, all of which were produced to the House Judiciary Committee. For example, on page 3523, there is one of the many memoranda of investigation interviews of witnesses by Starr and his staff. This one is of Deborah Ann Schiff. Here is a copy of it. There were boxes of such information produced by Ken Starr. The same type of information has to be produced here, especially when there were approximately 500 witnesses interviewed in the Mueller investigation, as the Attorney General stated in his March 24th letter to the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. In the Watergate investigation, the Justice Department did exactly the same thing after the grand jury, considering evidence, issued a report describing potentially criminal acts by President Nixon. The Justice Department filed briefs fully supporting disclosure of the report to the House Judiciary Committee and made the point that, quote, the need for the House to be able to make its profoundly important judgment on the basis of all available information is as compelling as any that could be conceived, close quote. And here are just two of the volumes from the Nixon impeachment proceedings that include some of the grand jury material, just some of the grand jury material that was produced to Congress, volumes 7 and 8 from the hearings before the House Judiciary Committee. Looking at volume 7, it is filled with grand jury testimony and other evidence from the investigation that was produced to the House Judiciary Committee. For example, on page 688 of volume 8, there is the grand jury testimony of Rosemary Woods. Here is a copy of it. There were volumes and volumes of such information produced in the Watergate investigation to the House Judiciary Committee. These examples of Congress receiving all of the relevant evidence in other analogous investigations help show how unprecedented it would be for Attorney General Barr to withhold from Congress potentially significant portions of Special Counsel Mueller's report and the underlying evidence and materials. The same type of information can and should be produced here. I ask unanimous consent to include these materials in the record. This subpoena authorization gives this committee the ability to compel production of the full report and related documents if the Attorney General departs from these and other precedents and refuses to produce to Congress the complete record of Special Counsel Mueller's investigation. I yield back the balance of my time. I now recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for any comments he may have on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to make two brief points. One is the gentleman from Wisconsin referenced the Starr report and the Jaworski report as precedent for not issuing a subpoena and, in fact, going to court. It should be noted that in both of those cases, the special and independent counsel went to court to seek authorization for the release of the grand jury testimony before it was delivered to Congress. They did that on their own. It didn't require Congress to litigate it. So those individuals recognized that it was important when they delivered the report to also deliver the underlying documents, and they sought permission from the court to do it. That has not happened in this case. In fact, Mr. Barr has done just the opposite. He's attempted to keep this information from Congress. So the notion that we should just wait and sort of pray and hope that Mr. Barr will suddenly find his way to the courthouse to seek authorization, I think is foolish. This subpoena will require him to take that action because, as the gentleman from Wisconsin said, he could move to quash the subpoena. That's one course of action. He could also go to court and move for the production of 60 materials so he can comply with the subpoena. And that's what we're hoping he will do if, in fact, they're interested in getting this information for Congress. So